So why is your footage shaky? So this could be for a few different reasons. First thing I will talk about is your camera's stabilization or lack thereof. If your camera doesn't have IBIS or lens stabilization, then it's going to be a shaky time, right? So what are those two things? So lens stabilization is the actual stabilization in your lens, if it has it, where it has like some electronic optical thing that it does with the lens, inside the lens, where it helps to stabilize the image. That's just in the lens, right? IBIS is in-body image stabilization. So this is in the actual camera body itself, and that's, as far as I understand, where the sensor has this little stabilizer where the sensor moves around inside the camera body to kind of smooth things out. Another thing to consider is that if you have lens stabilization and IBIS, and if they're done in such a way where they can work together to kind of have a dual stabilization, that's going to be probably better than if you just had one or the other, right? I don't know that all cameras have, stabilization systems where the lens could work with the IBIS. In some cases, I'm going to say, based on what I heard from Casey over at Camera Conspiracies, based on what I've heard him talk about with this, it seems like there might be a potential that some manufacturers of lenses might not work with other, camera bodies, in the sense that if you have like Olympus lens stabilization with Panasonic IBIS, they don't necessarily communicate well to each other compared to if you had like a more dedicated like Panasonic lens with a Panasonic IBIS, then it would work the best case scenario. Casey probably described it maybe a little bit differently, or maybe in a better way, or however he described it. So feel free to check out his content if you want to hear more on the lens stab and the IBIS and things like that. Anyway, so it's just worth noting that if you want to have a good lens stabilization and IBIS stabilization communicating and working well together, try to buy the same manufacturer of lens and same manufacturer of camera. This might not always be like super duper important, but it might have an effect, potentially. But I'm not an expert on this. But anyway, beyond that, your lens or your footage may look shaky depending on, because even if you have lens stab and IBIS for your camera, it might still be a little bit shaky, because depending on how good the lens stab or the IBIS is, you might still have some level of shake, but it would be smoother than if you didn't have any of these stabilization things. Or it's smoother with these stabilization options than if you didn't have any stabilization options. But say you still have some level of shake that you don't like. You can put it on a tripod, or you could put it on some other stabilization system, whether it's a gimbal. That's the electronic thing with the arms that kind of auto stabilize or level the camera. It's on like a little stick sometimes. So anyway, you could do that, but then that's a whole other extra piece of gear and expense and things like that. So these are some of the things that you could do right away to make your image more stable. Another thing you could do is just like, how are you holding your gear? If you're kind of holding it in a way that you're like super shaky, like if you're like holding it out here like this, you might start getting a little bit shaky, as opposed to if you're holding it more like this. I heard at least one person say in a YouTube video however long ago, it's like the more points of contact, the more stable. So if you have 2 or 3 points of contact, that's better than 1 point of contact. So 2 points would be like 2 hands, 3 points might be like 2 hands and like a camera strap around your neck or something like that. Yeah, so consider like what your strategy is for how you hold the camera. And you could do different things, like what I've already said, to try to help to smooth things out. It all depends on your budget or your kind of creativity, because you might be able to find different creative ways to keep the camera more stable that doesn't necessarily involve buying extra expensive gear. One thing you could do, and I heard about this from Marcus Picks on YouTube some time ago, he talked about something about just how heavier, I'll paraphrase what he said, but essentially heavier cameras have more stabilization because of the weight, right? So you could just make your camera heavier. Again, I'm kind of butchering or paraphrasing pretty heavily what Marcus said, but essentially take away that the heavier your camera is, the generally more stable it is, and the less like jittery it's going to be, but also the heavier it's going to be, so it might be tough to hold it for like an hour if it weighs 20 pounds. You know what I mean? Depending on what your position or what you're doing, right? So consider these things. If you have more questions about cameras, I have a Skool Community. Feel free to join the Skool Community and ask the questions that you have. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.